When you have a disorder of gut-brain interactions and you have gases that cause some degree of distension in your gut, the valves can fail to close completely, which allow things to flow in the opposite direction. And this is one mechanism as to how you can get bacteria from your large intestine going back up into the small intestine where there really shouldn't be any. And just to be clear on this point, in a healthy gut, almost all of your bacteria are in the far end of the pipeline that are down at the end of the large intestine and colon. They're not in the small intestine. Hey everyone, welcome to the Inflammation Nation podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Noseworthy.
One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases. And it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Inflammation Nation, where we like to stay up to date on how science can help you craft your own wellness journey. And if you haven't done it yet, please take a second and hit that subscribe or follow button right now so that you don't miss new content. And of course, that helps me reach more people with the message of science-informed wellness. Sometimes I use graphics and visuals and diagrams and charts up on the screen. So if you prefer the visual side of things, you can catch the full episode and the full video on YouTube. Today, we're talking about gut stuff. And more specifically, we're diving deep into SIBO, which stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And we're going to also talk about its clinical cousins, IMO and ISO. And so if you are someone who has been struggling with chronic bloating and abdominal distension, gas of various kinds, abdominal pain, unpredictable bowel habits, there's a high probability that you've been told that you have IBS or irritable bowel syndrome. And some practitioners might take it a step further and say, well, a large portion of people with IBS have it because they have this thing called SIBO. And if you are like millions of frustrated healthcare consumers, you've probably jumped on the SIBO hamster wheel. It's one of those hot topics over the last couple of years. Maybe you've even went so far in your do-it-yourself knack to jump on a 30-day herbal killing protocol, or maybe you've spent a small fortune on a round or two of heavy GI antibiotics like rifaximin, or maybe you've semi-starved yourself on a very strict low FODMAP diet for a month or more. At first, you start to feel like it's a miracle, your bloating vanishes, your stomach goes flat, you're feeling better, and you think, well, finally, I found the cure. Then a couple of weeks later, maybe a couple of months later, you start introducing foods again. A little broccoli here, an apple, maybe some sweet potatoes, and then boom, all of a sudden, the bloating comes roaring back with a vengeance, your stomach's distended, the brain fog's worse, and your practitioner, if you're working with one, might tell you, oh, well, we just didn't do it long enough, or maybe we need a stronger herbal protocol. Yeah, maybe they're right, maybe they're not. But what we want to do is take a science-informed view of the current literature on SIBO and its clinical cousins, and maybe eventually talk about why these cases tend to recur. I'm not sure I'll get to that in this episode just because I have so many things that I want to cover just in this introductory. But let's start with this statement that not all SIBO is the same. And again, SIBO, if you've never heard of this, stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Now, to understand why different dietary approaches or overgrowth protocols tend to fail, we need to make a couple of distinctions up front. And the first one is what I just said. Not all SIBO is the same. And I say that in the sense of causes, severity, and even downstream consequences, meaning that I can work one-on-one with two different people who indeed have SIBO, and I have to manage their cases differently, right? So let's say one person has acquired their SIBO after a bad bout of food poisoning, maybe after some acute gastroenteritis. And that puts me into an infectious model, perhaps even autoimmunity in some cases, and that could be a discussion for a different day. And maybe this first person has really severe dietary limitations and has to adhere to a very strict low FODMAP or SIBO diet for a very long period of time. But let's say that the next person with the same SIBO started after a concussion, which now puts me more into a neurological model And maybe that second person has far fewer dietary restrictions than the first one. And successful outcome for them depends not as much on how efficient we are at killing bugs that are in the intestines, but on how efficient or effective we are at restoring brain function. Now, if I tried to manage both of those cases with the exact same dietary approach, supplement approach, and so on, and if I don't account for the different mechanisms that cause their SIBO to begin with, then I would likely only be successful with one of those two cases. And of course, the more people that someone like me sees with SIBO, the more a one-size-fits-all approach really doesn't work. And this is simply recognizing that from person to person, SIBO can vary greatly, such that your SIBO is different than my SIBO, highlighting this notion of biochemical individuality that we love to talk about in functional medicine. You are different than somebody else. And this guiding principle basically says that everybody has to be treated like an individual, and that canned and easily reproduced protocols without personalization have far less chance of a successful outcome than if your protocol was crafted to you specifically. And I think this is the first, this first distinction should be obvious to anyone who has already tried and failed to heal themselves of their SIBO more than once. The second distinction that we need to make is that science has moved away from using the singular label of SIBO to explain things like abdominal distension and bloating after eating sugars, starches, and fibers, to distinguishing between three subtypes, only one of which still carries the name SIBO. And in fact, researchers and those of us who practice used to use the term functional gastrointestinal disorder to describe a wide variety of gut issues that are not tied to a specific disease, like ulcerative colitis, for example, or some kind of an anatomical change that's happening in the gut. But the official languaging has changed, and it's changed to the term disorders of gut-brain interactions. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the brain-gut axis. This is just kind of like formal terminology that's used in the gastroenterology research right now. And it's a much more scientific and much more accurate term, and it's right on the nose as it describes the nature of these problems. But let me point this out, which honestly should have been obvious to us years ago. When you use the term SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, you're designating two things. The first is location. It's the small intestine. The second is the nature of the infection, bacterial. So SIBO is a very specific condition where you have overgrowth of bacteria in a specific anatomical space, the small intestine. But we lumped other things that are not bacterial and not located in the small intestine under the same name of SIBO simply because they present with the same classic symptoms: bloating and distension after you eat sugar, starches, and fibers, sometimes with changes in bowel habits. Now, it turns out that some cases that we called SIBO were not bacterial at all, but they were fungal. And now we have also something called SIFO with an F. But more to my point, the term disorders of brain-gut interactions include a breakdown of SIBO into three distinct microbial phenotypes, not simple anatomical labels. Let me name them, and then I'll break them down. These three subtypes of disorders of brain-gut interactions are, number one, true SIBO, or let's say SIBO proper. Number two, IMO, IMO, which stands for Intestinal Methane or Methanogen Overgrowth, and ISO, which is Intestinal Sulfide or Sulfanogen Overgrowth. Let's start with SIBO proper. This is true bacterial overgrowth confined to the small intestine, right? In SIBO proper, bacteria colonize the small intestine where they should not really be, and they feed off the sugars, starches, and fibers in your diet, and they ferment them into hydrogen gas. And that part hasn't changed. That's all standard, and that's not different. That's not new. When someone has true SIBO and they're making more hydrogen than normal, because bacteria in your gut will normally make a small amount of hydrogen, it's usually associated with loose stools, sometimes frank diarrhea, and it's typically accompanied by pain fairly soon after eating and sometimes belching of one degree or another. Now, when I give you these symptom correlations as we go through, that's all they are. They're correlations. We can only use symptom patterns like this to narrow down probabilities and to guide our thinking process, which means we can't use them really diagnostically, right? And I'll have some comments on testing here in a little bit. So that's the first true SIBO. That's SIBO proper. That's the first subtype. The second subtype, which is a clinical cousin, as I mentioned before, and this used to be lumped into SIBO, is now called IMO, or Intestinal Methanogen Overgrowth. We used to call this methane dominant SIBO to distinguish it from hydrogen dominant SIBO that we just talked about, but that was a mistake for a couple of reasons. First of all, the organisms that make methane are not actually bacteria, but another class of organisms called Archaea. And while Archaea look like bacteria under a microscope, they're different at the molecular as well as the physiological level. And this means that antibiotics, which are designed for bacteria, perhaps even antibiotic herbal solutions that might be effective for SIBO, won't be effective for IMO, because Archaea are not bacteria, and things that are antibacterial are designed for bacteria. So that's mistake number one. The second mistake that was made was that researchers, in lumping IMO with SIBO, is the fact that the organisms that make methane, again, we call these methanogens, they can live anywhere in the intestinal system, including the colon. Yet the letters SI in the name SIBO localize the problem of SIBO to the small intestine specifically. But methanogens, while they can live anywhere along the course of the intestinal tract, live mostly at the bottom end, the far end of the large intestine and colon. And so with IMO, most of the methane is actually being produced in the colon, not the small intestine. So the dominant symptom pattern with IMO is a sluggish gut, low gut motility, constipation, and IMO is more likely, if you have that, in combination with floating or greasy stools in your bowel movements. Sorry to get descriptive, but that's the reality. Now, it's important to note again that a SIBO protocol won't fix IMO because these archaeal methanogens are not bacteria. So antibacterial strategies are going to fall there, or fail there, not fall there. The third and final type is ISO. And again, ISO stands for Intestinal Sulfide Overproduction or Overgrowth. And this is typically linked to diarrhea and abdominal pain, which sounds like true SIBO. But here might be a good distinction. With hydrogen sulfide, ISO, there's usually a foul, kind of sulfurous odor. There's some degree of bowel urgency, and it can get worse with high protein meals that contain sulfur-based amino acids, as well as any sulfur-containing supplements, things like MSM, N-acetylcysteine or NAC, and even glutathione. All of these have a sulfur base to them. And one interesting thing about ISO is that the organisms that make hydrogen sulfide actually consume hydrogen and methane as a fuel source. And so if someone who has ISO does a breath test looking for SIBO or even IMO, it can create false negatives because the ISO infection reduces the gases that the breath test looks for. And that brings me to the next core concept, and really the main theme of this particular episode is the diagnostic side of things and why I think we all should stop doing SIBO breath testing. So let me state right up front that you can't diagnose SIBO with a stool test. So researchers developed a breath test to account for that fact. But if you choose to do a breath test for these, I'm just going to use SIBO-like problems rather than having to rename them every single time. But if you choose to do a breath test for these SIBO-like problems, you face a few challenges that fall into a couple of different categories. The first is that there are labs that test for two gases, hydrogen and methane, but only a few that test for three. That would include the hydrogen sulfide. So if you have an ISO problem with increased hydrogen sulfide, but your test only looks for hydrogen methane, then you're probably going to miss it. And you may have to rely on your doctor to know the difference. What test is the right test to run? And on top of that, different labs use different substrates to provoke gas production. And we'll come back to that here in a moment. But here's how the testing works. First, you have to do a pretty strict pre-test diet where you eat nothing that falls into fruits, vegetables, and grains, nothing that can ferment in your gut, right? It's almost like you have to have a clean slate just to get started. But more than that, you have to avoid certain supplements and certain medications, sometimes up to 4 weeks before the test, if applicable. So depending on your individual scenario, it may not be that you can get a test in the mail today and actually get your sample collected and sent out within the next day or two. It's usually not that easy. But this is how the actual test is done. In the test kit, you get a series of breath capture bags that you blow into. that you breathe into. And you also get either a glucose or lactulose solution, which is a sugary drink that essentially the infection is going to feed on and create whatever characteristic gas is associated with that type of infection. And that initial capture of your breath before you drink the sugary solution serves as your baseline breath gas profile that's used for comparison. Then you drink the sugar solution, and at timed intervals over the next, say, couple of hours, you breathe into more bags, you have multiple of them, so that the lab can look at which gases change and at what time relative to your baseline. Now, understand that you're going to get different results if you use glucose as your sugary drink versus if you use lactulose. Glucose is rapidly absorbed in the small intestine, and it's actually better if you're trying to find true SIBO, but it's not suited to identify things like IMO. Lactulose, on the other hand, can reach the large intestine without being consumed entirely by the bacteria in the small intestine, which means it can't distinguish between overgrowth in the small intestine or the large intestine because the gases it produces happen everywhere in the GI pipeline. Now, to compensate for this lack of clarity, researchers look to when the gas of interest rises in the timeline and compared to the baseline sample, with the idea that the earlier a gas level rises, the more likely it's happening in the small intestine. But honestly, this is just a guess, because the one thing that confounds that approach is how fast things move through your gut, what we call transit time. People with faster transit times that show rapid or early rises in a gas make it look like it's happening in the small intestine, when in fact it's happening further down the pipeline because it didn't take very long to get there. On the other hand, constipation and slow motility can have the opposite effect. Yet researchers in designing the test kind of presume that everyone has the same transit time, and they don't. But let's go beyond that and talk about how gases from your gut can end up in your breath to begin with. Now, it might be tempting to think that gas gets produced in your intestines and it simply migrates back up to your mouth and gets incorporated into your breath as you breathe. But that's really actually not how it works. Your intestinal system is compartmentalized by different muscular valves, which are essentially circular muscles that open and close, acting like a valve, and we call these sphincter muscles. And these valves are designed to be one-way valves that allow foods to go from your mouth to your stomach, to your small intestine, to your large intestine, and then out the other end. In essence, these valves are designed to allow things to go from the top to the bottom and not the other direction. And once food passes through the valve, it closes down and it prevents things from migrating back up from where it just came from. But when you have a disorder of gut-brain interactions and you have gases that cause some degree of distension in your gut, the valves can fail to close completely, which allow things to flow in the opposite direction. And this is one mechanism as to how you can get bacteria from your large intestine going back up into the small intestine where there really shouldn't be any. And just to be clear on this point, in a healthy gut, almost all of your bacteria are in the far end of the pipeline, that are down at the end of the large intestine and colon. They're not in the small intestine. The small intestine has a relatively small bacterial load. We consider it to be relatively sterile, but nothing like the under end of the system where all the bacteria crowd down towards the end. And if you're tracking with me, you might be asking, well, if we have this valve system that can fail and it allows bacteria to go from the bottom of the system back up into the small intestine, why can't these gases do the same thing? Which goes back to the question of how do gases get back into your breath in the first place? Well, the answer to that is actually quite simple. If you could label a gas molecule, let's say we're looking at methane, if you could label it in the gut and then track it from there to your breath, this is what you would see. You would see the methane gas diffuse or cross the cells that line your gut. They will get into the bloodstream, travel through your blood to your lungs, and then get incorporated into your breath as you're breathing out. And this would take about 3 minutes. That's how long it takes. It doesn't take very long at all. And in fact, it's this phenomena of gases escaping your gut, getting into the bloodstream, and then into your breath. That's the exact physiology and science behind the breath test itself. So the gases don't travel backwards up your gut into your mouth and then breathed out. They travel through your blood, into your lungs. And that's why we can measure gases in your breath and make some conclusions about what's happening in your GI system. Now, let me give you a couple of final pieces about breath testing. All these labs that do this kind of testing have, of course, reference ranges. And in the literature, there are published cutoff values for if it's below this level, it's not a problem. If it's above this level, it is a problem. But none of these cutoff levels for these gases have actually been validated against what is considered the gold standard, which is counting the actual gas-forming bacteria or Archaea in samples from the small intestine. But beyond whether or not we can even trust the science that has confirmed accurate cutoff values for SIBO testing, these breath tests suffer from a serious problem of low statistical sensitivity. And this was stated emphatically in a meta-analysis in the Journal of Neurogastroenterology back in 2020. Now, what this means is that on average, a negative SIBO breath test is wrong about half the time, even when you have SIBO or IMO or ISO if you're doing a triple gas test. To say it another way, when a breath test is positive, you can trust that it to some extent you have that, but it doesn't tell you if your infection is indeed the small intestine. It could be somewhere else. However, if the breath test is negative, you really can't trust it at all, right? And that's a serious problem when it comes to deciding if you're going to spend good money and time on a test that can't answer the questions that you really need answers to. So let me summarize and give you a few takeaways before I close this episode. First of all, what used to be called SIBO is actually 3 different subtypes of disorders of brain-gut interactions. And these are TRUCE, where bacteria in the small intestine feed off fermentable sugars, starches, and fibers in your diet to produce hydrogen gas. That hydrogen gas creates changes in the gut environment, which tend to produce loose stools, abdominal pain right after eating, and sometimes belching. IMO is overgrowth not of bacteria, but Archaea, typically of the Methanobacter variety. And these are different from bacteria. They make methane, and it can happen anywhere in the GI tract, not just in the small intestine. But most of it is from the colon, and it's not from the small intestine at all. These methane overgrowth scenarios tend to slow down gut motility, cause constipation, and often show with floating greasy stools. And finally, ISO, intestinal hydrogen sulfide overgrowth, tends to be characterized by diarrhea, abdominal pain, but also brings bowel urgency, and it tends to create a foul odor and can be worsened by higher protein intake and nutritional supplements that contain sulfur, like MSM, NAC, and glutathione. Symptoms alone can't diagnose the 3 subtypes, but these symptom patterns can narrow down the possibilities, and they can guide clinical decision-making. And while there are different breath tests for SIBO and these SIBO-like conditions, the testing itself is fraught with challenges that reduce diagnostic clarity and make the test largely unreliable. So why waste your time and money? But through this all, and honestly, there's a lot more to say about the topic of these different types of disorders of brain-gut interactions, I hope you get the sense that, number one, SIBO isn't SIBO, meaning that there are too many variables in play as to whether or not your problem is bacterial or is it archaeal, which gas is being produced, and where is it being produced in the intestinal system? Where is that happening? And how does this mix with your personal gut transit time and your personal tolerance to diet and certain supplements? And as you can imagine, with all those things to consider, there really is no such thing as a universal SIBO protocol. So the next time that you see some internet talking head talking about this or that supplement or probiotic that fixed their SIBO, don't take the bait. And if you hear a practitioner, maybe on social media, talking about why they always do breath testing, or this is the breath testing that they prefer versus others, now that you're armed with enough knowledge to spot the faults in their statements, or at least I hope I did that for you. Whether you have SIBO, IMO, ISO, IBS, some other health issue related to your gut, your thyroid, your brain, your sleep, your energy, your adrenals, fill in the blank. You need to know that crafting wellness is not as simple as one-size-fits-all protocols. It requires identifying your unique root cause disruptors, evaluating your physiological foundational systems, and moving step by step through a structured health journey. And that's why I have chosen to run my practice strictly on a low-volume, high-engagement clinical model that's based in science and human physiology. And when people work with me one-on-one, they deal with me directly, and everything from your diagnostic plan to your diet, your exercise approach, your nutritional supplements, they're all personalized by me for you. No cookie cutter protocols, no farming you out to staff members who are not credentialed or not trained in functional medicine. So if you want to look in the episode description right now, you will find my direct phone number, my email, link to my secure online intake form. You can click that link, fill out a private contact card, and let's schedule your one-on-one discovery consultation over Zoom. Thanks, guys, for listening to the Inflammation Nation. Don't forget, put your big rocks in first, and I will see you in the next episode. This podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine in any form or capacity. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of the information in this podcast or any materials associated with or linked to the podcast is at the listener's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional and personalized medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and listeners should not disregard or delay obtaining proper medical advice when a health condition exists and warrants that. And finally, functional medicine is not intended or designed to treat disease, but rather is a natural approach to support restoring health and wellness. The use of diet and lifestyle modifications and nutritional supplementation is supportive or adjunctive care.